So this is a conversation with Brian Hioe. He's one of the founding editors of New Bloom magazine, which came out of Taiwan's 2014 Sunflower Movement, in which Brian also participated. The topics covered in this episode are numerous, which is why I really wanted to have Brian on and use his encyclopedic knowledge of Taiwan and the region to give us an overview of the complicated history and recent political developments of Taiwan and why they matter. By the end of this episode, you would have hopefully gained a better idea of Taiwan's political history and more recent developments. These include the 2014 Sunflower Movement and its significance, including the impact that Occupy Wall Street has had on it, the role of independent media, including New Bloom magazine of course, the subsequent elections 2016 and 2020 and their significance today, Taiwan's generational shift with younger generations increasingly identifying as Taiwanese and not Chinese, the multi-faceted relationship between Hongkongers and Taiwanese, especially the younger generations involved in protest movements in both countries, Taiwan's very complicated relationship to the so-called international community, here referring to the United Nations and its various bodies, as well as other nation-states. The role of these UN agencies, including the WHO, in erasing Taiwanese identity, recently highlighted by Taiwan's successful handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. China's role in trying to de facto annex Taiwan, including the possibility of a military invasion. The failures of China's stated one country, two systems policy, Taiwan's indigenous history as well as its past under Japanese occupation, among other topics. As you can see, they are quite numerous. As usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at @FridayTimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon or on buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and buymeacoffee.com has both options. Thank you for your time.
So I'm Brian Hioe. I'm one of the founding editors of New Bloom magazine, which was a radical left publication formed in Taiwan after the 2014 Sunflower Movement. And so it's been about 6 years since then. I was a participant in the movement, and a lot of the members at the time were then participants in the movement as well, here on the ground in Taipei, or as part of diaspora communities that were seeking ways to contribute from afar and connect to the movement as it was happening here.
So part of the goal of this podcast is to introduce regions and countries to one another. And from what I can tell, based on the limited statistics that I have of this podcast, most people who listen to the podcast are either in the Middle East or in the West. And I would suspect, again, based on some of the feedback, that a percentage of the latter is kind of like diaspora group. So I think it's fair to assume that most listeners don't know much about Taiwan, other than maybe some of the big headlines that appear from time to time. So with that in mind, can we start with you giving a general introduction and contextualization of the Sunflower Movement and then of the presidential elections that followed?
Mm-hmm. So the Sunflower Movement, which occurred, broke out on March 18th, 2014, was in opposition to a free trade agreement that was to be signed between the Taiwanese and Chinese governments. This would allow for Chinese investment in Taiwan's service sector industry, but it was feared that this would lead to deterioration in political freedoms in Taiwan, particularly because regarding, for example, freedoms of speech and press and that kind of thing, particularly because companies would self-censor or take acts to censor their employees because of Chinese investment. This was thought to be a way by the pro-China KMT to narrow the political and economic space between Taiwan and China in a way to allow for political unification. And so this is one of the reasons why young people reacted against this. Young people in Taiwan increasingly identify as Taiwanese and not Chinese. And so attempts by the KMT, which is the former authoritarian party in Taiwan and ruled over Taiwan as a one-party state for decades and what was once the longest martial law period in the world, is still trying to advance this kind of unification between Taiwan and China. The KMT fled to Taiwan after its defeat to the Chinese Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War, bringing with it what became later 10% of the Taiwanese population, who constitute a kind of sub-ethnic group at that point in time and were a political and economic elite. People that are descended from them include even me. And so the KMT is still trying to advance the kind of unification of Taiwan and China, despite the fact that it historically was seeking to retake China. But after this became impossible with the economic and political rise of China, the KMT is now just in favor of achieving unification no matter what. No matter under what grounds. And I think that a lot of it returns to the fact that the KMT, when it came to Taiwan, was as a settler colonial regime, and this kind of elite that were the political elite during authoritarian times, for them it actually doesn't matter as much if Taiwan and China are unified. They would still enjoy their elite privileges, and this allows access to a larger market and They can kind of just jump between Taiwan and China as a kind of cross-border, cross-strait hopping bourgeoisie. And so the Sunflower Movement actually was historic because it was this kind of youth uprising against the KMT. There had previously been movements in Taiwan, such as the 1990 Wild Lily Movement, which was also a student occupation against the KMT's authoritarian rule. But then after that, there was a wave of young people participating in politics that led to the results of 2020 presidential elections. And that put the DPP, which is a center-left party that emerged from the Taiwanese democracy movement in decades past, into power. And it was actually just kind of reversal of political fortunes because before 2016, it was thought that the KMT, perhaps it had actually retaken power and this would not be a reversible trend and that Taiwan would not have a future in that sense. And so then 2020 elections put the DPP back in power again and confirmed another 4 years. And so it was kind of one can see this kind of the elections that happened after 2014 as all having to do with the momentum that took place after the Sunflower Movement, with this youth attempt to resist the KMT's efforts at unification.
And so, also with that in mind, can you explain why the fact that the Sunflower Movement, the fact that it was generally progressive or like had a generally left-wing outlook, why does it matter so much in the context of Taiwan and Taiwanese history?
So the political left has historically been weak in Taiwan because of decades of KMT repression. And so what's also interesting is that along with the Sunflower Movement, there's a new wave of interest of young people within left political ideas or progressive ideas or that kind of thing. And sometimes not too clear to me why there was such a generational shift between, for example, this generation and generations past. I think the attempts to fight against Taiwan's marginalization from the international world have resulted in a interest in kind of left-wing ideas because of seeing all these kind of movements appear and pop up from place to place of young people that have progressive values and are more left-wing and that kind of thing. And so then the Sunflower Movement was not maybe explicitly a left-wing movement, but many of the young people that participated or were organized within it were interested in left-wing ideas. And so one observes this wave of, for example, labor organizing after the movement. Or one also observes, for example, the push for legalizing gay marriage after the movement. And these are things that couldn't really have happened beforehand. I think that the Sunflower Movement was empowering of young people. Again, it was specifically against this trade agreement. There are some people that took issues with, for example, the process by which it was passed. There are people that took issues with the trade agreement itself, that it was to be signed with China. And there are others that were critical of free trade altogether, pointing to that Taiwan is caught between these superpowers, America and China. And these people were in the minority. However, there are still kind of attempts to push these ideas and to raise Taiwan's how to contextualize Taiwan in terms of international left. And so forming a publication like New Bloom is even part of these efforts.
So I'm going to talk a bit about the. I'm going to reference the Daybreak project. Would you mind first giving some context of what the Daybreak project is and like how did it come about?
So Daybreak Project was an attempt to document the Sunflower Movement. It's around 400,000 words and involves interviews with like 80 or 90 participants in the movement, just a full-length transcript of why they participated in the movement, how they became involved in activism, do they see the Sunflower Movement as like a left-wing movement, or how did they understand the demands of the movement? Was it only against the free trade movement because it was side with China? Was it against free trade altogether? And those kind of questions. And I think particularly for me, it was a way to kind of exercise the specter of the Sunflower Movement because it had been such a big event in my life. Before the event, I was not as involved in Taiwanese politics. And after the movement, that seems to be most of where all my organizing efforts have been steered towards. And so just trying to understand this moment in time that somehow I was part of, along with the generation of young people, and how to really kind of understand that. And so it also includes it's primarily this oral history archive, but also it has a timeline of the movement. It has an encyclopedia documenting the kind of visual language of the movement and just kind of various theoretical takes on the movement or attempts to contextualize the movement in terms of a broader context. And particularly the attempt was to package the movement in a way that this would allow for people that were not on the ground to understand it, for people in international context to understand it, or even for people to revisit their pasts as they were young activists participating in the movement.
So on the Daybreak website, there are 5 posts listed on the theory, and I'm going to just read them now, and we'll kind of discuss it, and I'll ask you to comment on them. So these are the questions. The first one: what changed about the social atmosphere in Taiwan after the Sunflower Movement? The second one is: was the Sunflower Movement a sign of Taiwan's incomplete democratic transition? The third one: structural economic causes for the Sunflower Movement. Fourth one: a reaction against KMT crony capitalism. And the fifth one: did the Sunflower Movement disprove say goodbye to Taiwan? So these are like 5 questions around the Sunflower Movement, and they're kind of asking the same question in different ways in a certain sense. So would it be possible for you to kind of go through them, however you feel most comfortable, obviously, and kind of try and answer them in a sense.
Mhm. Yeah, and so that was, I think, really attempting to grapple with just, again, how to theoretically understand the movement. Particularly before the movement, there was a sense of apocalypticism. There was a sense that young people had no future in Taiwan. They were facing stark economic realities, such as only making 22,000 NT per month. You would have to not eat or drink for over 10 years in order to afford a home in Taipei. And then perhaps Taiwan's democratic freedoms as a whole would be eroded because of Chinese influence or annexation from China. And so there's this kind of hopelessness at the time, but after the movement, there's a sudden shift. Young people felt empowered to enter politics. They had taken part in an event that had greatly altered society and put a lot of focus on young people who were actually, before the movement, they were denigrated as just kind of useless, as a strawberry generation that was soft and not as strong as their parents, and that was just kind of not able to do things, and that their economic precarity was viewed as a sign of their own personal failings. But then suddenly there was a focus on young people, a sense of empowerment, and this led young people to enter politics in a way that ultimately did change Taiwan. It reversed the trend toward unification and towards the erosion of democratic freedoms. And so, before the movement, there were arguments from the international world that Taiwan had no future, that it was just a matter of time until annexation from China. And this actually just changed after the movement, just that this generation of young people in Taiwan did not actually want this to happen. And so then I think also there's a lot, I think just the movement was framed a lot of times in terms of that, just regarding the independence unification issue, but then going back to the economic roots of it, a lot of it has to do with the fact that young people across the world face conditions of economic precarity, and that includes Taiwan. Sunflower Movement took place 3 years after Occupy Wall Street, which spotlighted many of these issues internationally. And the fact that it took the form of an occupation-style movement took place at a time in which there was a wave of occupation-style movements across the world after Occupy Wall Street. Just again looking at this kind of tactic that was taking place in another part of the world. And a lot of it also has to do, I think, with the reaction against the specific model of control of the KMT, in which one had crony capitalism, that local power networks were maintained through economic ties between conglomerates and development companies with local politicians and that kind of thing. And this is actually, it's strange actually that Taiwan is touted, originally it was touted as originally Taiwan was propped up as a right-wing dictatorship under Chiang Kai-shek and his son Chiang Ching-kuo against China, in the model of America and other Western powers propping up right-wing dictatorships across the world. But then after that, Taiwan was suddenly touted as a free market democracy, I think again just to juxtapose Taiwan to China as something amenable to Western powers. And I think that again, just the Sunflower Movement really pointed to a lot of the incomplete democratic transition in Taiwan. The fact that the KMT was allowed to exist after the after democratization, despite the fact that it was a former authoritarian party, that its power networks in particularly local rural countrysides, for example, were still unbroken. Those are a lot of the issues that the movement raised.
The generational angle in Taiwan is very interesting to me, and from what I can see, there's also the generation angle in Hong Kong. And there's definitely, so it's interesting to me because in the region it's very much also youth-led. So in the case of both Iraq and Lebanon, in Iraq you sort of have a generation that grew up, or that's now growing up post-2003 invasion. And in Lebanon, it's especially the generation that, my generation essentially, those that grew up after the war. The war ended in 1990. And this generation angle I feel like is not really talked about as much, but although maybe you might be repeating yourself a bit, if that's okay, can you highlight a bit more, can you emphasize a bit more of why there is this generational divide specifically at this point in time?
I think a lot of it actually has to do with that the current generation of young people grew up after the democratic transition, and so they didn't have this direct experience of authoritarianism. And so in that sense, they were actually, I think particularly because of the history of authoritarianism, of military rule, of martial law, there was a generation that was actually, the phrase often is that they're cold to politics, that they're indifferent to politics. They view politics as something dirty and scary that you shouldn't get involved in, that you will have consequences regarding if you get involved in. And this is not the case with young people because of the fact that they grew up with democratic freedoms. And so they were more willing to take these kind of dramatic forms of action in order to protest something. And also because of the history of the democratic transition, young people had the example of their predecessors in the democracy movement and the actions they took during that point in order to cause a democratic transition to happen. And so I think that was also inspiring to young people, that they could actually build on the legacy of their people that came before, that there was a model that they could look at. And I think the other aspect of it is that maybe again just these economic conditions of precarity. The previous generations did not experience this. They experienced a high economic boom, a kind of economic miracle, which is just simply unable to happen in the present. And I think that was also a key part of it.
You actually mentioned, I think, in one of the pieces, I forgot if it was on Daybreak or on one of your own personal pieces on New Bloom or elsewhere. But there was actually sort of an effort, I think, between to link up sort of like the veterans of the pro-democracy movement and the newer generation, wasn't there?
Yeah, that's right. So actually, a lot of the older people from the pro-democracy movement in the past, they eventually went on to form NGOs, or they became academics, or they're still around in some form. It only took place not too long ago, really, historically, 30 years ago. And so they're still around, and they can pass on their experiences to the next generation in that sense. And I think actually Taiwan, in terms of social movements, had really benefited from this ability to pass on experiences. I think the other aspect of it too is that the young people in Taiwan are China is much more remote for them, actually. In the past, previous generations, they might have parents that came from China, or there is still this kind of fixation on China. For young people, sometimes the current generation is referred to as a nationally independent generation, that they naturally view themselves as Taiwanese and not Chinese. And so this identity shift, I think, is another aspect of it.
So I first read your article, Man Was Born for Love and Revolution, which is a quote by Japanese writer Osamu Dazai. I first heard of it because it's also the title of the podcast episode that you did with Matt from The Arts of Travel. And Matt was a guest of this podcast, and I was a guest of his not long after you were, actually. When I reread your piece recently, so yesterday, I was actually reminded of the previous episode I did with Lina Munzer just a couple of days ago. She's a Beirut-based writer and translator. And the reason why I thought of it is that she described the October 19 uprising in very kind of emotional terms. Like, she described it as an act of love. She described it as even her feeling like personally high from kind of like the collective. And she even used the title of a Lebanese film, which the title is A Feeling Greater Than Love, to describe it. Can you talk a bit about your piece, the context of that piece, because it includes you going to Hong Kong and to participate and document the protests over there, and at the same time, like the rather unique relationship between Hong Kong and Taiwan, given the ongoing developments in both countries?
Yeah, I think there's this feeling of solidarity when you're on the ground in a social movement that is very hard to describe. And, a feeling greater than love is one way of phrasing that. And I think that's also what I was getting at with this quote, man was born for love and revolution. Just the feeling of connection with people that are strangers that you might encounter just once and never encounter again, of being part of a community. Particularly occupation-style movements tend to, oftentimes the participants in them will describe them as being like communities or feeling like communities, and they describe a sense of being uprooted from that community when the occupation ends, because all occupations eventually end. They usually do not become anything that's permanently sustainable. And so I think this is one of those things in social movements, and I think that it's something even that I've been particularly striving after, I think after the Sunflower Movement, that regarding, for example, what I was saying regarding trying to exercise the specter of the Sunflower Movement, is that I've always been maybe trying to pursue that sense of solidarity in the years since then. And sometimes I even wonder if that's what drove me to actually go to Hong Kong in that sense. And that touches upon international solidarity, that, you can feel connections with people across the world in terms of support, emotional support or otherwise, from knowing that they stand in solidarity with you, that they feel that they stand for your struggle despite not being there, not being on the ground, and not even having direct connection to you. With Taiwan and Hong Kong, there's been this historical relation, I guess you could frame it in terms of solidarity. I think a lot of it returns to projection back and forth, because of the fact that Hong Kong offers a potential vision of what Taiwan could become if it fell under Chinese control. The notion of one country, two systems as implemented in Hong Kong was originally a political formula that was formulated to appeal to Taiwan. And so, that's one of the unusual things, actually. It's viewed as a potential future for Taiwan if it could become like Hong Kong. And on the other hand, from Hong Kong, there's the view of Taiwan sometimes in these utopic terms almost, that this is an alternative, that this is what Hong Kong could be if it were not under Chinese control. And so, there's also this sense of connection back and forth. And I think particularly with young people, it's furthered by the fact that many of us grow up consuming each other's media, particularly of this generation. People are in their 20s and 30s and early 40s, that you grow up watching Hong Kong films or Taiwanese films back and forth, and so you kind of have an understanding. You feel a sense of connection in that sense. And so then I went to Hong Kong to report on the protests, and also just like a decision that I just made something in the dead of night, that okay, I felt like I should be there to bear witness to what was going on, despite the fact that actually I couldn't do anything there. My ability to write and report is much more limited by the fact that I don't speak Cantonese, for example, and and my local networks. I mean, I do know people, but obviously it's not as extensive as in Taiwan. And whereas in Taiwan, I think that I could actually produce, for example, in a similar social event, I could produce much more. Whereas in Hong Kong, it would just be another kind of body on the ground. But I think a lot of activists actually did go over at the time during the protests at various points. For example, National Day on October 1st saw a great deal of travel from Taiwan to Hong Kong of protesters, and so people were being searched at airports. Particularly young Taiwanese men were being profiled and searched as to whether their luggage contained gas masks or protest equipment and that kind of thing. And so then, I think that the piece I wrote, Man Was Born for Revolution, was specifically in the context of seeing someone I knew appear in the news. There's an attempt to occupy the Hong Kong Legislative Council, and specifically what he said, he took off his mask, revealed his identity publicly, despite the fact that this could put him in jail for years. And he urged an occupation similar to what happened in Taiwan. He actually specifically drew that example, that there should be an occupation similar to what happened in the Sunflower Movement. And so that was something I knew, and it was just very bizarre seeing someone that I had encountered twice really in the news in that way. But again, regarding these ties with solidarity, or the fact that there have been extensive ties between Hong Kong and Taiwanese activists going back years before the Umbrella Movement or Sunflower Movement even took place, between people that later became well known in these movements, but actually just had known each other from doing similar causes or in attempts in years past, and just seeing people that appear in the news, it's a very bizarre feeling. And just seeing people potentially face life-changing consequences as a result of the actions they take. And that's another thing that I think about solidarity, just had this kind of strange sense of connection. And so I think that's kind of what I was trying to explore with that piece.
And just as a kind of an addendum, can you just expand a bit on what the one country, two system model actually entailed?
Mm-hmm. So that would be the claim that despite unification, quote unquote, that Hong Kong or Taiwan be allowed to keep their political autonomy and economic autonomy. I think part of it was that, particularly China, when it was in the period of opening up, it was actually advantageous to have a place that could attract foreign investment that was not as would not spook people off because of a lack of political freedom and so forth. But also it was seen as a gradual way to narrow the gap between China and these places, in the sense that that eventually these places would become more amenable to Chinese political control and integration into China writ large as time went on. That there would be a time period, for example, until 2047, that Hong Kong would be allowed to preserve its political autonomy. But that did not happen. As soon as the handover happened, Hong Kong's political and economic space began, the distance from China began shrinking. And another factor in that was the economic rise of China in the decades since.
So the very first episode of this podcast was actually with JP from Lausanne, which is this Hong Kong-oriented left-wing collective that you're also a part of. She spoke about how Hong Kong's crisis and obviously the recent protests in the past few years, part of it is actually like an existential crisis because Hong Kong has a literal expiry date, like when the 50-year, whatever it's called, lease or... I'm describing it as an expiry date because that's how I've heard it described. Could the same be said about Taiwan, that Taiwan also has this existential crisis?
I think so, because again, just one country, two systems was originally formulated to Taiwan, but there's the fear that, for example, if the KMT came back to power, it would just undertake actions to, again, just bring Taiwan closer to China in a way that facilitates political unification. And so there's that fear, and that fear has been present for a long time. And, before 2020 elections, because of the fact that it seemed like the KMT might come back to power, there's a phrase that people were using, quote unquote, national doom, the sense that Taiwan was over or would be finished, or again, this kind of sense of apocalypticism after the KMT came back to power. But I think the other thing is that Hong Kong is already under Chinese control in that sense. The Hong Kong government is already subordinate to the Chinese government, whereas in Taiwan there's the threat of military invasion from China. China conducts military exercises around Taiwan in order to threaten it to make it feel afraid, and this happens even in spite of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one has also observed, and there has been research done into this, that there's a spike in online bots on Twitter and other places calling for the extermination of all of Taiwan's residents and just basically bringing in a new population from China. And so, it's probably not a serious threat. It's really just another attempt at intimidation, but there's this kind of rhetoric out there. And so a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be very costly in terms of Chinese and Taiwanese lives, but this rhetoric goes on, and so this kind of existential threat does exist. The entire generation of young people would be killed off if that happened, in invasion. And it would actually, I mean, it kind of returns to Taiwan's colonial history that there's been a lot of these, whenever a new regime comes in from Japan or from the KMT or whatever, one does see this kind of attempt to exterminate, young people and political leaders and that kind of thing. But I mean, so it is something that's happened before. But I mean, just it is perceived oftentimes as an existential threat in terms of identity, in terms of culture, in terms of being able to maintain your way of life and what have you.
You mentioned that there was, a Japanese occupation at some point, and this is what I meant in the beginning when I said that I think it is fair to assume that a lot of these massive episodes in Taiwan's history are actually not well known. For example, I think that many people may not even know that Taiwan has its or indigenous peoples were living in Taiwan even before the waves of migrations from China. To whatever extent you feel most comfortable, can you just talk a bit about this kind of like added layers of complexity within Taiwan's history when it comes to its indigenous population, when it comes to its quote unquote Japanese past in the sense of the Japanese occupation, and even previous colonizations efforts as well?
Yeah, that's right. I think there's the misconception a lot of times that Taiwan was empty and that there was nobody here before the KMT came. And so the KMT brought what only was 10% of the present population, or their descendants are 10% of the present population, and that includes me. And so that group, that sub-ethnic group, Waishenren, constitute a kind of political and economic elite under KMT times, but around 88% of the population is Han as well, but they came from earlier waves of migration, and 2% is indigenous. And so these are the earliest inhabitants of Taiwan. However, as part of the KMT's kind of attempt to colonize Taiwan as part of settler colonialism, the attempt was to erase the history of the indigenous history of Taiwan. There were people these were the original inhabitants of Taiwan, and so everything is phrased in terms of China-centric terms. The claim is even made to that the Taiwan's indigenous population is something like the ethnic minority groups in China, and so that's not the case. And then Taiwan also had a 50-year Japanese colonial period because it was ceded to Japan after the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. And so for 50 years, Taiwan was colonized by the Japanese. And that also served as another thing that splits off Taiwan from China, actually, that there's this Japanese colonial period and an entire generation grew up speaking Japanese only. That actually a lot of literary works in that generation are all produced in Japanese. And the other thing is actually Taiwan has not always been incorporated into China. It became incorporated in the Qing dynasty on more formal grounds, but at various terms at various points in Chinese history is considered as kind of hinterland, or this kind of this region of savage barbarians, that is to say indigenous, or that kind of thing. And so it's actually not part of China from, not part of this kind of unbroken 5,000 years of Chinese history, the way that is often phrased by either the KMT or by the CCP.
So Taiwan's very difficult connections and international relations is something that's often talked about, I feel, and especially more recently it's been really at the focus of some headlines due to its lack of relationship to the World Health Organization, and which is, as I said, been highlighted recently due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you talk a bit about specifically Taiwan's relationship to the World Health Organization, why that's such a big problem, and maybe kind of like to squeeze in a side question to this, like Taiwan's relationship to this quote-unquote international community, by which we mean like the UN, the big organizations associated with the UN, as well as its individual or like state-to-state relationships as well.
Yeah, so Taiwan is excluded from the UN, is not part of the UN, and the majority of the countries in the world do not recognize it. And that also translates to being excluded from UN organizations such as the World Health Organization, but also organizations such as the International Civil Aviation Association, which regulates aviation safety. And so it actually creates a weird loophole in, let's say, global health or global aviation safety that Taiwan excluded from that. And particularly because of Taiwan's successes fighting off COVID-19, that has been highlighted recently. Various countries in the world are interested in so-called the secret sauce as why Taiwan was able to fight this off. And then this raises the fact that Taiwan excluded from the World Health Organization has actually been denied, for example, information on the spread of the pandemic and other medical resources and that kind of thing. And so it's actually very bizarre. For example, Taiwanese are not allowed to enter UN buildings because they do not have Chinese ID. Because Taiwan is de facto independent as a juridical entity, as a government with its own political system. No, Taiwanese do not have Chinese IDs, and this also translates to other things. Like, for example, Taiwanese indigenous to participate in UN conferences on indigenous people, they need someone else to sponsor them, another group to kind of get them in that way. Despite the fact that they have actually been able to do this for years and years and years. And so it's one of those things that this is oftentimes this occurs because of Chinese pressure within these organizations. As China's political and economic clout has grown over the years, its ability to affect international organizations and their stances on Taiwan has increased. But this is one of the ways in which Taiwan is excluded from the international community, quote unquote, and this has ended up having real world effects sometimes. And the WHO spotlights that this is not just a kind of diplomatic game; that this actually does have real effects, particularly because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's a way in which, I mean, I think just international bodies are a way for oftentimes for larger countries to really exert pressure on smaller countries, and this is one of those cases regarding Taiwan and China.
The WHO issue was there's this video that went viral some weeks ago of this reporter. I think she was from Taiwan, and she was asking him like basically like, what are your comments on Taiwan's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and he was at first like kind of avoiding the question, and then at some point he just said something along the lines of like all parts of China, like basically that why are you asking me about this specific part of China, because obviously the assumption there or the implication there is that Taiwan is part of China. Can I ask, like, I don't know, this may be too personal, I don't know, so feel free to answer however you feel most comfortable, but like, how does it feel to actually be a Taiwanese person watching a video like this, for example, and just seeing the blatantness of this official from the WHO, which is supposed to be, again, this international health body that is supposed to, quote unquote, put politics aside? Like, how does it actually feel to see something like this?
I think it's like almost being denied existence in that sense. It's that in the eyes of these international agencies, you're just kind of a non-person in that sense. I mean, or that you're just Chinese. Just actually the claim that then Taiwan can be treated as though we're just part of China when, it just doesn't make sense, because the fact is that there's a different government and different policies were rolled out. And so if you're, looking at it from this global health standpoint, it is not logical. But I think it also just points to the way in which these kind of large international bodies are actually all about geopolitics at the end of the day. Now, for example, American and Western powers are really jumping on board with pushing for Taiwan's inclusion in WHO, or its ability to participate as a observer. But this is actually still just kind of diplomatic baseball, or just a great power competition, really, because now this is a way to attack China on the issue, to pin blame for the COVID-19 pandemic on China in a way. So then I think it just returns the state of Taiwan as being caught between these various superpowers, in which Taiwan's existence is really just treated as a way to accomplish some end. It's at the mercy of much larger powers. I think that's the case with a lot of countries, but Taiwan is a particularly odd example, because the fact is that it is excluded to such a large extent. But then there are other countries too that are not recognized by the UN, and that is another issue. And I think building ties with the these various people's struggles for recognition is something that's important because of that.
And like finally, I have this rather abstract question. It's kind of like two questions in one. Do you think there's some potential in bridge building between activists from such places as Taiwan? So there, especially places and countries that have recently seen protests. So Taiwan, Hong Kong, Lebanon, Chile, Iraq, Algeria. These are some of the names. Sudan as well. These are some of the countries that in the past few years have seen some kind of significant shifts in their political landscape. To put it mildly, in a sense, kind of like to generalize a bit. So that would be the first question. Like, do you see potential in bridge building between movements in these countries? And the second question is, can you talk about, and to, I guess, some of the disinformation, some of the misconceptions that are very common on, especially we see in online circles on Twitter. I see it quite a lot in the Anglosphere when it comes to Taiwan, and particularly, unfortunately, in segments of the left. Can you talk a bit about these two in a sense, or maybe you might want to separate them depending on how you feel most comfortable?
Yeah, so I think it's vitally important to build ties between different people's struggles around the world, rather than relying on state actors, because I think connection between state actors is all about interest at the end of the day. How states use each other for their mutual interest, or it becomes about just bigger countries being able to exert pressure on smaller countries. And so I think building a connection between disparate people's struggles that don't immediately draw a connection, in which connections are not self-apparent right away, such as Taiwan or Hong Kong or Lebanon, Chile, Iraq, Algeria, and all other places. I mean, a lot of people will actually be very dismissive of that. They'll be just like, what is the point in that? You can't actually accomplish anything that way. But I think there are ways to do that, and I think these are actually the connections to rely on, because they're not bound by interest. Solidarity exists, and people really talk about that as a very abstract concept in many ways. because it's actually not very clear sometimes what different struggles can offer to each other apart from support. Emotional support is something that when I've talked to activists about why they want ties of solidarity, why they seek to build ties of international solidarity, they say this is what actually they get out of it. They feel a sense of connection, and this is, because struggles wear down on you. This sense of connection actually can be a way to motivate you to keep going, to feel like part of something larger. And I think also just building platforms for exchanging tactics is something that I'd like to work on. And right now I'm involved in a project to build a website to exchange protest tactics, for example, between different contexts. What tactics are applicable in one place versus another based on local conditions, and just how struggles can learn from each other. And I think the way in which struggles from different regions learn from each other, such as the ones we've described, can also be revealing about, I think, the structure of world power, that it is, again, oftentimes smaller countries caught between superpowers that have much more power than they do, and you see this trend become it's much more self-apparent to you when you actually look at events taking place across the world. Oftentimes the thread between them is actually the ability of the United States to operate, for example, globally. That kind of thing. But then that brings us to the question of how the left often views Taiwan, which is that the left sometimes has not moved beyond the view of Taiwan as kind of right-wing dictatorship propped up by the U.S. in order to counter China. Taiwan democratized. The current political party that's in power came out of the democracy movement. But sometimes actually people will just view it as, again, another U.S. proxy agent that's just propped up in order to basically stick it to China. Or they'll view it in terms of the fact that Taiwanese manufacturers such as Foxconn were very exploitative of Chinese workers during the initial eras of China's economic opening up, and as a result a lot of these kind of major Chinese companies are Taiwanese owned actually, such as Foxconn. But then Taiwan has its working class, it has its own labor history, and it's not just Foxconn, and so that's one of the issues on the left. And I think that it's an inability to think beyond, I think, this kind of framing of Taiwan by the U.S. state historically. The left has actually internalized this in some sense, and so sometimes it does not actually recognize the struggles in Taiwan. Particularly Taiwan and Hong Kong are phrased as color revolutions then sometimes, just that this is all just the CIA, and something like that, just this is all the CIA or the State Department just trying to do something to really affect China, but that's not what it is. And I think that's a very difficult thing to work around. And I think just actually building ties of international solidarity in order that people can recognize that there's a Taiwanese left, which is not just something propped up by the State Department or what have you, is something that's vitally important. And so that was kind of the impetus in building something such as New Bloom, to have a website that could be at least a voice of the Taiwanese left in that sense on the international stage. And that's part of why it became a English language publication as time went on.
I was kind of picturing earlier when you were talking about some of these things, that kind of like Lebanese listeners sort of like nodding their heads along as I'm doing, because there are some similarities between Lebanon and Taiwan that are quite something. I'll try and list some of them off the top of my head, but one of the things about Lebanese history is that there is this romanticization of the 50s and the 60s, as in this is where kind of like was the heydays of Lebanon. And that's when Lebanon had a free market economy, which it still has to this day. And I'm putting free market in quotations, kind of like this laissez-faire capitalism kind of thing that was assisted by the state, actually. And Lebanon was actually compared to Hong Kong at some point, as Hong Kong in the sense of this hyper-capitalistic society and being characterized in those terms. And there was actually even debates within some segments of the left in the, I think, 60s and 70s, and you would have these terms of like Hanoi versus Hong Kong. So like Hanoi being the leftists and Hong Kong being the nationalists or the right-wingers, let's put it that way. And this was always very crass characterization, the oversimplification of everything. The Civil War was actually never really about just left and right. This unraveled fairly early on, and most of it ended up becoming like well, I won't go into the complexities of the Civil War now, but it was never just about left versus right, more often than not. And something else is the fact that Lebanon is very, very small. Like, it's an extremely small, one of the smallest countries in the world, and it only has a population of around 5 to 6 million. We don't actually know how many because there's no census, which is a different problem. And it's always framed in let's say, global discourse, in a sense, as either this relatively safe haven where people are more liberal than the rest of the Arab world, and there's always some truth to it. It is more often than not, it is more liberal on some things than other parts of the Arab world. But in other terms, it's like this backwater of extremism, and everyone is just sectarian, and everyone just thinks in sectarian terms, and you kind of have these two um, extreme nodes in a sense, competing off one another within global discourse. You mentioned that there is this image of Taiwan as that it's an image that's essentially frozen in time. Like Taiwan is still this right-wing dictatorship. It's still back then. Nothing since then has changed. But can you talk a bit about the fact that recognition of Taiwan actually changed quite dramatically in, I think, the 70s, from countries almost exclusively recognizing Taiwan to countries almost exclusively recognizing China?
Mm. Yeah, I think, well, I mean, what happened specifically regarding that is that the U.S. decided to recognize China diplomatically versus the ROC they decided to recognize the PRC in China rather than the ROC in Taiwan. And so then the rest of the world followed suit because of global American power. And so I think particularly regarding that, propping up Taiwan as a bastion of democracy, despite it actually being a right-wing dictatorship, then afterwards claiming that's a free market democracy versus China. This framing all comes from America, and I think that particularly with Lebanon and other places in the world, and the kind of tropes one sees in international media regarding how they're framed, it actually oftentimes just comes from the standpoint of American political power or just Western political power globally. And I think that's one of the issues. And I think that particularly for the left, it is an issue that much of the left had actually uncritically accepted this framing, and rather than actually getting to know the people's struggles which do take place in these places. And so I think that's one of the issues, actually, that just the ability to think beyond this political framing that actually comes from basically the standpoint of Western imperialism just does not happen, actually. And just how to actually get beyond that is one of those things that's somewhat challenging. And I think it's actually tremendously frustrating. But yeah, I mean, it also just says how much I think the power of the West or of America is globally, that entire nations and just the ways in which they're thought of are determined from its political standpoint.
And here it's obviously important to emphasize, although like it goes without saying in your case, but I'll mention it for my case as well, that whenever I would critique American exceptionism, American imperialism, does not mean that I'm just hoping for someone else to kind of sweep in and take their position, because we've seen this quite a lot. This what Leila Shami, a good friend and a Syrian British writer, like what she calls basically the anti-imperialism of idiots. And it's I called it, I think, like essentialist anti-imperialism, but I think the way she phrased it is just more directly to the point. And in the context of Lebanon, you very much have the leader of Hezbollah, for example, Hassan Nasrallah, in one of his speeches saying basically that we should turn to China and we should do deals with China. And then there was a lot of jokes following that, because like it was so sudden and no one really was expecting that. But it does really follow this political dynamics that we were talking about, that it is usually either one or the other, and they end up like entire political, sorry, how to say this, like entire forms of politics end up just being formed by these two nodes of power, these two great powers like China and the United States. And in context of Lebanon, there's the additional dimensions of Israel and Iran and the Saudis and other complexities that are not that interesting for this episode. But the importance of bearing witness, like you said that you went to Hong Kong knowing that you may not have much to do, in the sense you didn't speak Cantonese. It's not that you went there with this what might be called in other contexts like saviorist mentality whatsoever. It's just, it was a matter of bearing witness, and this is something that I feel isn't understood well enough. So maybe I'll just let you kind of end on that tone and to comment on that. But in the context of Lebanon, we've seen a lot. So sorry, I'll just give brief context on this. In between October and November especially, I was being asked a lot of questions. I was interviewed on a number of podcasts. I placed myself in some of these networks to talk to, especially independent podcasts and media outlets, to talk about what's been happening in Lebanon. And there's always the question of like, well, what can we do to help? Like, what is something that we can do to help the protesters in Lebanon? And my answer has always been the same thing. Like, first, learn what's happening. Like, just educate yourself on what's happening. It's always good to know more. Like, so just do that on a very, very basic level. And the second thing is just bear witness to what's happening. Send solidarities from your side. And this, I know sending solidarity can be such a vague thing, and sometimes, it doesn't actually do much. But bearing witness can simply be something along the lines of, I myself and others wrote this letter in English, which was then translated into Cantonese, addressed to protesters in Hong Kong, basically saying, "We sign solidarity. It's solidarity with you." And like thousands of people retweeted it on Twitter, and kind of went quote unquote viral within for a certain period of time. And what that did is it just put on the map, so to speak, or at least on people's. It connected to a certain extent Lebanon with Hong Kong. So more people from Lebanon and more people from Hong Kong suddenly sort of became aware of one another, and that was just one spark. And the idea that I'm trying to get at is that there are actually very easy ways these days with the internet, with people who are bilingual and trilingual and others, to translate statements from one place to another, to translate articles. Like, if I had resources, I would translate the entirety of the Daybreak website into Arabic. And it's that kind of thing. And those things actually make a difference, because it's not just that we're bearing witness, which is very important, but through that we're also creating different ways of seeing the world that does not entirely depend on these binary of China versus the United States, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a real failure to think beyond this kind of bipolar world landscape in which not relying on one power means relying on the other. And that's one of the challenges of actually how to articulate that. And I think the way precisely to do that is through this building these kind of connections. But again, yeah, as you said, it's more impossible now than ever through the internet, using translation to work beyond languages. And actually just building connections, because oftentimes, again, solidarity, you can't actually directly do something for other people, but just bearing witness and confirming their existence and staying informed about what's going on with struggles across the world and building connections such as through your podcast and things like that. This is actually vitally important. And I think that this is something that people need to do more of. But I think, unfortunately, just a lot of people are still kind of caught in this mindset of realpolitik or geopolitics or whatever. And that just, having more of these grassroots efforts and having translation occur through platforms online, this is more possible now than ever. And I think that's actually the only way forward. I think that's the way to get beyond this, bipolar world and actually start thinking about, what does it mean to, build something that's like people that are non-aligned with either power, and building connection between people rather than states. Between movements and learning from each other organically, and eventually hoping to arrive at some kind of collective action or thing, organically. I mean, right now, just maybe offering support and solidarity and emotional support in that sense, and making people recognize each other's struggles is the best thing we can do. But eventually, I think that organically something else might develop after that, with changing conditions in the world as they are now.
So Brian, on that note, I really want to thank you for your time. Your answers were really encyclopedic. I hope that people listening to this will be as informed by the end of it as I was. And yeah, I just want to really thank you for your time for this.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invite.